In October, I leave the house at 4 in the morning and I come back at 11 at night. And for 6 days I did exactly that, because that is what October is. Combine, grain cart, semi, repeat. You do not look around in October. You look at 40 feet of standing corn in front of you and you keep the header down and you go, because the weather is coming and the weather does not care. On the 7th day, I took the combine to the far quarter and there was a berm running across my field. It ran east to west over 160 acres of my ground, straight as a chalk line. Raw dirt heaped over a trench, still dark and wet on top. It went from the fence line of the Prairie Ridge subdivision across my corn to the county road. Somebody had dug a trench 4 feet deep and half a mile long through the middle of my farm, laid something in it, covered it back over, and gone home. I shut the machine down. I climbed out into the stubble and I did not call anybody. I walked. I walked the whole length of that berm, road to fence, counting my steps, because I am 56 years old and I have learned that when you are angry, the first useful thing you can do is measure something. My name is Vince Nowotny. I farm 640 acres of corn and beans in Iowa on ground my great-grandfather broke, and I am the 4th Nowotny to do it. I am not a lawyer and I am not an engineer. I am, for what it's worth, an elected trustee of County Drainage District No. 12, which is a thing most people outside this state have never heard of, and which will matter later in a way I did not want it to. At the far end, on their side of the fence, sat a manhole cover in fresh gravel. Brand new, still shining. Prairie Ridge is 210 houses on what used to be the Kubik place, and the city had them under a septic-to-sewer conversion order, connect to the new trunk line by the deadline, or eat a building moratorium and daily penalties. The legal route for their main went around my farm, the long way, at roughly 4 times the cost, and it required somebody to knock on my door with a checkbook and the word easement in their mouth. Nobody ever knocked. The president of that association was Brett Coyle, 48, and here is the part that matters more than anything else about him. Before he retired early and bought a lot at Prairie Ridge, Brett Coyle spent 22 years with the Municipal Public Works Department, the last 6 of them running it. Sewer, water, storm. He had signed permits. He had inspected other men's trenches. He had, I am absolutely certain, written up contractors for less than what was buried in my field. He had also stood up at an association meeting in June and promised 210 households he would get them connected without a special assessment and without anybody losing a dime. He kept that promise. He just kept it with my dirt. I drove over the next morning and Brett came out of the clubhouse with his arms
Vince,
already
my
spread.
friend,
That's
look at
how it
this
began,
place.
with a
We
hug
are open
that never
for
landed. He was so sorry. It was a mix-up. It was an honest mistake, and he'd make it right,
If we
and we're
commit to
all
this,
neighbors here. And then he said it, out loud, in front of 2 board members and the contractor's foreman, with my phone
Our
recording
Q3
in my
strategy
shirt pocket.
hinges entirely
Because
on this
whatever
product
else
launch.
I am not a
Failure
man who
is
walks
simply-
into a room like that unarmed. Vince, he said, we were sure there was an easement. There's easements all through here. It's a field. I said I'd get back to him. It took 1 afternoon at the county recorder to close that question forever. There is no easement across my farm. Not recorded, not implied, not prescriptive, not anything. Nobody has ever had the right to put so much as a fence post in that ground. And there was a second thing, which was better, and which a man who ran a public works department knew perfectly well. A homeowners association has no power of eminent domain. None. 0. The city could have taken an easement across my land. That's what condemnation is for. There's a whole process, appraisals, hearings, a check, and Brett Coyle had personally walked that process a dozen times from the other side of the table. A homeowners association is a private club with a mailing list. It cannot take 1 square foot of anybody's land for any reason at any price. What the city can do with a court order, the association had done with a backhoe. I sent Brett one letter, certified, 4 sentences, and then I stopped talking to him. No easement, never had been. The line was trespassing and would have to come out. I would not be negotiating a price after the fact. And one more line, which I put in because I have spent 30 years fixing tile and I know what a trench does to a field. You have crossed my drainage. Do not touch anything else until we talk. Then it rained. An inch and a half on a Thursday, which in October is nothing. A rain a field like mine drinks and forgets. On Friday, the Fark water was standing in water. I need to explain what that means because it is the whole story and almost nobody outside this business understands it. Under every good field in Iowa, there is a network of pipe buried 4 feet down that pulls the water out of the ground and carries it away. And it is the only reason this dirt grows corn instead of being a slough with ducks on it. Subsurface tile. It is invisible. It is a century old. And it is the entire economy of this state. My mains are clay, laid in 1936 by my grandfather with a team and a trencher and a great deal of profanity, and they outlet into the district's main at the road, which is exactly why a 100-year-old private tile line is not only my private business. When the tile works, an inch and a half is gone by morning. When the tile is cut, the water has nowhere to go. The field becomes a shallow lake, everything under it dies, and you cannot drive a 40,000-pound combine across it to harvest what hasn't died yet. 60 acres of my corn stood in 8 inches of water for 2 weeks and rotted where it stood. The insurance man came out on a Tuesday. Decent guy, known him 15 years. He walked the edge of the water, looked at that berm lying across my field like a scar, stood there a long while, and then said the sentence I'd been dreading since I saw the manhole cover. Vince, this isn't weather. Multi-peril crop insurance covers acts of God, drought, hail, flood, disease. It does not cover a third party who cuts your drainage, because that is not a peril.
This is
that
worse than
is
I
a
thought,
tort,
Vince.
and the answer
whole
to a
system
tort
is
is a lawsuit, not a claim. He filled out his paperwork, and he denied it, and he felt terrible, and he was right. The one thing standing between an Iowa farmer and ruin every single year is that policy, and Brett Coyle had made mine worthless with a rented trencher and 11 hours of somebody else's labor. That's when it got physical. They sent a surveyor onto my ground to set stakes. My ground, after all of it. I pulled them. They set them again. Somebody cut my north fence in 3 places, which is not vandalism when you run cattle. It's a thing that gets a family killed on a county road at night. And I walked that line with a spool and a pair of pliers at 10 o'clock in the rain while my corn drowned. Their trucks ran up and down my headland, the strip you turn machinery on, and packed it to concrete. So on the second Monday, I parked the grain cart across their access and left it there. Brett called the sheriff on me, on my own land. Young deputy, and he was halfway into his speech about work sites when I handed him the recorder's search and my deed and stood in the mud and let him read. He read it twice. Then he looked up at that berm and said quietly, "Sir, who told them they could do this?" "Nobody," I said. "That's the whole thing." He went and had a conversation with Brett that I could not hear and would have paid money to hear. The trucks stopped crossing my headland, and a woman who'd come down from the subdivision to watch, Sandy Pyle, 3 houses in from the corner, the only person from Prairie Ridge who ever came over on her own, stood at my fence with her arms crossed the entire time, saying nothing, listening to every word. That was the day I understood what this actually was. Nobody was arguing about whether they were wrong. Everybody knew they were wrong. The fight was going to be about what happens to people who are wrong, which is a completely different question. And the answer in this country, most of the time, is a check and a shrug. I didn't want a check. I wanted my field back. Which brought me to the map. It hangs on the shop wall by the door, and my wife had it laminated 20 years ago. Every tile line under this farm, drawn to scale in pencil in 1936, depths written along each run in my grandfather's little block letters. I tell people it's the only heirloom we've got, and I'm about half joking, because almost nobody has these. Everybody's grandfather laid tile. Hardly anybody's grandfather drew a map. And most of the maps that got drawn went into a burn barrel in 1979 when somebody cleaned out a shop. Mine didn't. I laid it out under the light and found the main. 12-inch clay, north-northwest across the far quarter, 4 feet down. I put their berm across it in my head and found the crossing, 240 yards east of the fence in the low spot. Exactly where a man with a map would know to look, and where a man without one could dig for 100 years. I took the little excavator out on a grey afternoon and opened it up. 4 feet down I found their sewer main, plastic, green, new. 18 inches under that I found my grandfather's tile, and it was cut clean through, and the two open ends stared at each other across a gap where a trencher had gone through them like they were nothing. That alone is a violation. Damaging drainage in this state is not an oops, we'll pay for it. The districts exist precisely because this dirt is worthless without them, and there are statutes with teeth. You cut a main, you report it, you stop, you fix it under supervision, and it costs you money and time and a good deal of humility. But that is not what I found. That is not why I am telling you any of this. Both ends of that cut main had been plugged with black contractor bags. Not shoved in, tied. Somebody had worked a bag into the mouth of a 12-inch tile, knotted it off, done the same to the other end, and buried the whole thing under 4 feet of dirt. I sat down on the tread of that excavator and looked at it for a long time. Because a garbage bag is not an accident. Cutting a tile is an accident. They're 100 years old and nobody knows where they are, and it happens constantly. What happens next is a phone call. Somebody in that trench got out of the machine, saw a severed clay main pouring groundwater into their excavation, understood exactly what it was, and hid it. Because reporting it means stopping. Stopping means the drainage district comes out. And the drainage district would have asked to see the easement. They knew what they'd cut. They tied it off, buried it, and kept digging for the road. And then I did the hardest thing I have ever done with a shovel in my hand, which was put it back. I photographed it in place with the date. I pulled the dirt back over it, blade graded the scar, and dragged stubble across the top until you could not tell from the road that anything out there had been touched. Because if I hauled that pipe up and drove it to the clubhouse, it would be my word, my photo, my story. A farmer with a grudge and a backhoe, and their lawyer, would have a year to make me into a man who staged it. But if it stayed in the ground, then someday somebody else would have to lift it out. I want to be honest about the risk, because there was one, and I lay awake on it. Brett knew where that tile was cut. His crew put the bag in it. 2 things saved me. The contractor was long gone, paid, released, off to a job in another county. And no crew comes back at night to dig up a finished trench on land their client says is fine. And Brett Coyle himself had never once set foot on my ground. Not when they surveyed it, not when they cut it, not when I blocked the access. He had walked that whole route on a screen. He'd run a public works department for 6 years, and somewhere in there, he had turned into a man who believed a thing was true because his GPS said so, and the ground was just what the map was printed on. So he never came out. And by the 2nd week of November, there was 6 inches of standing water over the crossing, because they'd cut the tile, which meant nobody was digging anything out there. Their own trench protected me. Then I resigned my trusty seat, which is the least dramatic sentence in this story and one of the most important. You cannot sit on a drainage district board and vote on an enforcement action about your own farm. So I recused, stepped off, and took the whole thing to the district as a plain landowner. And the district didn't want it. I have to say that part plainly, because people picture a cavalry. What I got was a room with 3 trustees I'd sat beside for 9 years, all of them looking at their hands. Prairie Ridge had 210 households in it. The district assesses landowners, and every dollar of a lawsuit comes out of assessments, and the man across the table from me said out loud that it looked like a private dispute between me and my neighbors, and maybe I ought to take my check. He wasn't crooked, he was tired, and he was 61, and he did not want to spend the district's money on a fight about one man's tile. So I made it not be about one man's tile. I sat in that room and I walked them through where my main outlets, into theirs,
We are done
at the
negotiating.
road, which means a bag tied into my grandfather's pipe is a bag tied into the head of a system that drains 11,000 acres and 40-some other farms. And if a homeowners association can cut a private main in this district and settle it quietly with a check, then there is no main in this district, and there is no district. It took 2 meetings. The vote was 3-1. The one voted no. He still won't look at me at the elevator. 2 more things landed that winter, and neither of them was a repentant man in my yard. Nobody came to my yard. The first was discovery, which is a boring word for a knife. The contractor's project file subpoenaed. The route marked in a handheld GPS unit and exported timestamped, walked by Brett Coyle personally on a Tuesday in September. And under it, a text from Brett to the foreman sent at 6:40 in the morning on the day they broke ground. Needed closed before he's out of the field. They didn't pick October because it was convenient. They picked October because it was the only 7 days of the year I physically could not look up. The second thing was my father's file cabinet, a green steel 4-drawer that weighs about what a hog does, in which Dad kept every piece of paper that ever came to this farm. There's a story in this family about the time a developer came out here in the early 2000s and Dad said no, and that was the end of it. That's the whole story, the way it gets told. Nobody ever mentioned Dad also kept the letter. Folder marked land in his handwriting. A letter dated the 14th of March, 2003, from the development company that later built Prairie Ridge, requesting an easement for a future utility corridor across the North 160. Clipped to it, the carbon of Dad's answer, 6 words in his slanted hand. No. Do not ask me again. They asked. 20 years ago they asked, and they got an answer. And that answer went into a file at a development office and became institutional knowledge. And when the deadline got tight and the legal route got expensive, somebody remembered exactly where the shortcut ran and exactly why it wasn't available. We were sure there was an easement. It's a field. Sitting next to a letter with a date on it, that stops being stupidity. Stupidity is a defense. Lying is not. And then my combine finished the job, which I still find funny.
I know you
Modern
were the one who
machine
told
weighs
them,
the
Brett.
grain across the elevator and marries it to GPS. So at the end of a season, you have a map of your field, colored bushel by bushel at about 10-foot resolution. I complain about it every fall. That machine knows more about my ground than I do and hasn't got the decency to keep it to itself. I pulled 6 years of maps and laid them beside the year of the trench, and there it was, drawn by a computer in color. A perfect drowned stripe spreading north from the cut, coordinate by coordinate. No expert to impeach, no farmer's guess. A machine that had been counting corn on that dirt for 6 seasons said, here is what this ground does every year, and here is what it did the year they came. The district's lawyer did not file for money. She filed for a mandatory injunction, ejectment, which most people don't know is available, so let me put it plainly.
We are here to
When somebody builds a structure on land they have no right to, a court does not have to let them keep it and pay you rent. A court can order them to take it out, all of it, at their own cost and restore the ground. Now, courts don't always do that. There's a doctrine about weighing the hardship. If a man puts a garage 6 inches over your line by honest mistake, you generally get a check because tearing down a garage over 6 inches is a punishment, not a remedy. That balance is the only thing that ever protects a defendant in a case like this. It protects the innocent ones. An innocent mistake would have cost Prairie Ridge a check. What they'd actually done cost them a trench. The association's lawyer offered money, then more money, then a great deal of money plus a recorded permanent easement. Generous, clean, done. I said no. Because of what the appraiser laid out at the hearing in the flattest voice you ever heard, like a man reading a grocery list. Year 1, the drowned crop, 60 acres, plus the acres I couldn't get a machine onto. Year 2, prevented planting on the low ground because it will not dry in time, so the whole quarter at a fraction. Year 3, the same, plus compaction, plus farming around a wet hole. Year 4, if the main is properly repaired in year 1, maybe 80%. Then he looked up and said the part that made the room go quiet. If it isn't repaired, he said, it isn't a loss. It's just no longer farmland. That is what a garbage bag in a clay pipe does. A man with a clipboard, not angry at all, in one sentence. The court gave us everything. Remove the line in its entirety. Restore the drainage to original specification under the supervision of the district's engineer. Defendant pays. The district's own enforcement action came in behind it, and the DNR came in behind that, because it turned out nobody had ever pulled a construction permit for the main either. Brett had run it right up to the road and stopped, waiting to tie into the city trunk during the winter shutdown when the inspector's schedule got thin. He never got the chance. Half a mile of sanitary sewer built across a private farm by a man who had spent 22 years enforcing the exact rules he broke. They dug it up in November. Cold, grey, 41 degrees, rain that never got going and never quit. 2 excavators, a crew of 11, the district's engineer with a tablet in a plastic bag, and Brett Coyle standing at the edge of my field in clean tan boots that had never been on a worksite in their life. 40-some Prairie Ridge homeowners strung along the fence because word travels, and because every one of them had just opened a letter about an emergency assessment. Sandy Pyle was at the fence too, right where she'd stood in the mud in October, arms crossed, still not saying anything. They had to take out every foot of it. Half a mile of green plastic, 4 feet down, in the rain, out of a field that had been theirs for 11 hours in October and was never theirs at all. And it went badly, for the most beautiful reason available. The trench kept filling. They'd open 40 feet and it would fill, and they'd pump, and it would fill again, and the walls sloughed in because the ground was saturated, because the field would not drain, because they had cut the tile. Their own trench was drowning them. They had broken the machine that would have made their job possible, and now they had to do the job anyway, standing in the wreckage of it. By noon, the engineer told them what any farmer could have told them in July. You cannot get this line out of the ground until the water has somewhere to go. You have to fix the main first. So the Prairie Ridge Homeowners Association hired my tile crew, my guys, the ones I've used for 20 years, and paid them, at association expense, to repair my grandfather's drainage main, so that they could then be permitted to remove their own trespass from my property. They paid the men they robbed for permission to undo the robbery. I have turned that over a lot of times since, and it has not gotten old. And that is how the bag came up. Early afternoon, hole pumped down, crew cutting into the cross-section to expose the break. The excavator lifted a section of that old clay main out to make room, and it swung up dripping on the end of the thumb 4 feet of 100-year-old tile. And there, knotted, black, intact, perfectly preserved in the mud where a man had shoved it 2 months before, was the bag. Everything stopped. The operator, to his eternal credit, held it right there at eye level and did not move. The district engineer walked over and looked at it for a while. He's a county man. He's 50 years old and has spent his whole career around exactly this kind of pipe, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not look at the homeowners at the fence. He looked at Brett Coyle. "Somebody tied that off," he said. "That's not a mistake. You know that better than I do, Brett. You run a sewer department." Brett opened his mouth, and nothing came out of it. Not one word. 40 of his neighbors watched the man who had promised them there would be no assessment stand in the rain and fail to produce a sentence next to a plastic bag hanging in the air on the end of an excavator. Sandy Pyle turned around and walked back up the hill to her house. She never did say anything to me, not once, the whole time. She didn't have to. She'd been standing at that fence since October, and she'd heard the deputy ask who told them they could do this, and now she'd seen the answer come up out of the ground. I didn't say a word either. Not one, all day. I stood 40 feet off with my hands in my jacket and let my grandfather's map and my father's letter and a machine that counts corn and a black plastic bag do the talking, and every one of them was more articulate than I have ever managed to be in my life. The rest is arithmetic. The line came out over 9 days. The main was rebuilt to spec, the district signed it off, and the invoice went to Prairie Ridge, along with the removal, the fill, the restoration, and my damages across 4 seasons, the way the appraiser counted them. The city's moratorium landed on the subdivision anyway, since they now had no sewer connection at all, and a deadline that had gone by, and the legal route around my farm got built the following summer at exactly the price it was always going to cost, the price Brett Coyle had promised his neighbors they'd never have to pay. He was charged for the drainage violation and for the unpermitted construction. His 22 years in public works, which he'd offered the association as his qualification, turned out to be the strongest evidence against him. A man who has written up other people's trenches does not get to be confused about a tied-off tile. He lost the presidency inside a week. He sold in the spring. They tried at the end to put it on the contractor, but the contractor had a project file and a text message with a timestamp on it. Needed closed before he's out of the field. That sentence did more damage than any lawyer in the county. Spring came late. In April, I stood on the far quarter after a 2-inch rain and watched water go where water is supposed to go, down into a 100-year-old clay main and away the way it has since Hoover was president, for my grandfather and my father and now me. There's a scar across that field you can still see from the road. It'll be there another 10 years. I went back to the shop and hung the map on its nail. And then I did a thing my grandfather did in 1936 and nobody has done since, which is take a pencil to it, the date, the station, the length of new tile, and the word repaired. First new line on that map in 89 years. My handwriting doesn't look one bit like his. Let me give you the version where Brett Coyle gets away with it, because it's closer than anybody at that fence wanted to believe. He picks the 7 days a farmer physically cannot look up. He runs the line, covers it, and when the tile turns up in the trench, he has it tied off and buried, because a cut main is the one thing that stops a job. The field drowns, the insurance denies, and the farmer, who has just lost a crop, has no policy and is looking at a lawsuit against 210 households, takes the very large check and the recorded easement because that is what almost everybody does. Nobody ever knows the bag is down there. The line stays. It's still there, in that version, under the corn forever. Every single thing that broke that plan was boring. A pencil map from 1936 because his grandfather drew one and yours didn't. A letter his father filed 20 years ago saying, "No, do not ask me again," which turned, We were sure there was an easement from stupidity into perjury with a date on it. A combine that had been counting bushels by GPS for 6 seasons and could draw the drowned stripe better than any expert. A text message with a timestamp, and a man who found the worst thing in the world 4 feet down and put the dirt back, because evidence you carry to somebody is a story, and evidence they have to lift out of the ground themselves in front of 40 neighbors is a verdict. 3 things to carry with you. An HOA cannot take your land, not for any price, not for any reason. Only a government can condemn, and only through a process. A trespass is not automatically a bill. Courts can order a structure removed, and the balance of hardship doctrine that protects an honest mistake does not protect a deliberate one, which is exactly why the bag mattered more than the trench. And crop insurance covers weather, not neighbors. The second a third party causes your loss, your policy is paper, and your case is everything. Now be honest with me. They offered Vince a very large check and a permanent easement, and he said no, and it cost him a year and a crop to make them dig it back out. Principle or pride? I go back and forth. Tell me where you land.